Speaker, Professor Danny Wong. Professor Danny Wong is currently Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, University Malaya. He is also Professor of History at the Department of History, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, University Malaya, where he teaches History of Southeast Asia and History of China. His research interests include the Chinese in Malaysia, Chinese relations with Southeast Asia, and history of Sabah. His more recent publications include New Perspectives on Chinese Studies in Malaysia and Singapore, Wang Gungwu and Malaysia, One Crowded Moment of Glory, Chinese Studies in Malaysia and Singapore in a Global Context. In addition, Professor Wong is a Fellow of the Academy of Sciences, Malaysia. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please welcome Professor Danny Wong.
A very good morning to all of you, board members of the ISCOR, the senior management of the Maranatha Christian University, our fellow participants, papers presenters, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all of you. And greetings from University Malaya, and I'd like to take this opportunity, first of all, to thank ISCOR and also the Maranatha Christian University for inviting me to speak at this very important event. And really, it's an honor to be here. It's a really humbling experience. The topic that I'm going to speak on will be something that has been mentioned quite a bit. I was looking at the slides of Prof. Leo, and I said, oh, we are having almost identical slides. So anyway, it is my sincere hope that whatever sharing we're going to do today will be of some use to all of us, will be able to maybe to generate some discussion and also some possible work in the future. Prof. Leo speak mainly on the policy of China towards the Chinese overseas and also or the ethnic Chinese all over the world. And but I'm not going to touch on that, but I'm going to touch on how the rise of China actually impacted the overseas Chinese overseas. So this is what I'm going to focus on. There are many aspects of it, and so therefore I hope you will be able to look into this impact of the rise of China on the various aspects relating to the Chinese overseas in Southeast Asia. So the focal point is still on Southeast Asia. I think the idea is that what I hope to achieve is to actually help us to make some sense of the rise of China and its impact on the Chinese overseas. And at the same time, to look at possible area of future research. So what I'm going to do is that this is the outline of the presentation. And so I'm going to touch on the past experience of the Chinese in Southeast Asia. And that will be before 1978. And what happened after 1978 with the rise of China. So of course, there are many aspects of it that you can discuss on, but I'm going to just point out 7 aspects of it on the rise of China and its impact on the Chinese in Southeast Asia. And so there will be questions pertaining to the renewed tribe, news media and culture, revival of Chinese language, tertiary education in China, business opportunities, well, the question of ethnic Chinese in China, as well as the Xing Yiming that was alluded to or discussed by Prof. Leo just now. So, if we were to look at the Chinese experience in Southeast Asia, they vary from country to country. By just looking at this table itself, you can tell some stories. One, if you look at, for example, in Singapore, there are 2.7 million Chinese identified as Chinese, ethnic Chinese. And with these 2.7 million people, they constitute 76% of the population, of the country's population. In Malaysia, my country, we have 7 million, but we are making up of 20% of the total population. And likewise, in Thailand, you have around 7, although in Thailand it is a bit difficult to count, but 7 million would be a safe figure. And with that 7 million, they constitute about 10 to 12% of the total population of Thailand. But if you go down to Indonesia, 2.8 million, which is quite similar to Singapore, it only constitutes 1.4% of the total population. So in other words, if by looking at this table itself, it tells you that the experiences of the Chinese in Southeast Asia would be very different. Each of them went through different phases of development, historical development. Sometimes it was very peaceful, sometimes it was less so, and of course there were the different challenges posed to the Chinese in each of these countries. But generally, many of these experiences can be quite common as well. And therefore, the Chinese became something that is very interesting. Many scholars have, since the 1950s, have begun to do their research. For instance, we have Victor Parcel, who have written a very comprehensive work. This is the pioneering work by Victor Parcel, The Chinese in Southeast Asia. And this has been translated into different languages as well. In 1974, Mary Sommer Heides also published a book on Southeast Asia's Chinese minorities. Yes, the Chinese has been termed as minorities in Southeast Asia, other than Singapore, which has a great majority. The rest of the Chinese in Southeast Asia are basically minority. And by being minority, some of these countries like Malaysia, Thailand, they are a sizable minority, and therefore you cannot ignore them either. And if you were to look into the history of the Chinese in the region, one would remember that they are also important in terms of their hold on the economy, at least the perceived way, the traditional way of being perceived as having a strong hold on the economy. And therefore they remain to be interesting, they remain to be perhaps even controversial. But at the same time, having lived in these countries for many years, sometimes many generations, and being loyal citizens of their countries, but then at times they also face many challenges, having need to live and negotiate through impact of the indigenous rise to power. And sometimes their existence, their loyalty have been questioned as well. So, and in many countries, there were also policies. They have to endure policies that privileges the indigenous communities. And all this, I think, if you were to study the history of the Chinese in Southeast Asia, you'll find that this could be a very common kind of experience shaped by many Chinese in different countries, but of course at different degree of severity and so on. The rise of China in recent years, the last 40 years, have somehow a profound impact, at least to me, on some of the Chinese life, the way we live and so on, and has provided some new perspectives to the experience of being ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia. The next few slides will talk a bit more on history. I was tempted to throw away some part of this but then maybe it will take up a bit of time, but then being historian, I think I cannot run away from talking about history. Well, literature first. I think we have seen quite a lot of work being done on the Chinese in Southeast Asia. other than Haiders as well as Victor Parcel. More recent years, we have seen the work of Professor Wang Gangwu. This has been a profound impact on the way we look at the Chinese in Southeast Asia. But among his work, there are also work on that he had actually studied the relations between China and the Chinese overseas. So this is a very important piece of work. And he also had another work, which is China and the World since 1949. And these are very important work that lay the foundation for us to, the latecomers, to actually delve into it and start to investigate. Prof. Leong himself had contributed enormously, and we can see that the other three works are all associated with Prof. Leong. Southeast Asian Chinese in China, ethnic Chinese as Southeast Asians, and ethnic Chinese in Singapore and Malaysia. Both of us share a very, very important point, or at least some thought on this. We are very conscious of the fact that we are Southeast Asian Chinese. We are not China Chinese. And this distinction is something that we hold dear in our life, in our work as well. So this is something that I think many of the Southeast Asian Chinese who are here today will also think likewise. So let me go back to my profession of being a historian. Let's talk a bit on the past. So the experience of being part of this ethnic Chinese experience in Southeast Asia should be termed as long and lasting presence. We have been around for many years. Prof. Liu had mentioned that, or rather Prof. Lee have mentioned that the Chinese have been here perhaps since even the time of the Han Dynasty, trading, business, and so on. And we have seen Liang Dynasty as a very definite account of the Chinese being here in Southeast Asia, trading. Maybe some of them have settled down and so on. And we have seen work by Prof. Wang Gangwu again, Nanhai Trade, talking about the Song Dynasty kind of Chinese coming out to trade, to settle down maybe. But it was the 600 years ago when Admiral Zheng He and his voyagers, the many Ming voyagers that brought the Chinese out in large number. And we have seen some of the settlements that lasted for at least 60 years in different parts of the Malaccan Straits, and therefore after that some of them settled down. So if one were to look at the many Chinese cemeteries in Jakarta, Jakarta, Batavia, and also in Manila, in Bangkok, in Malacca, one would find many of these cemeteries actually trace back to at least late Ming Dynasty, late Ming. So this actually gives the Chinese a long-lasting presence in this region. This is something that many people have not realized, that actually the Chinese have been around for many, many years. So we can see some of these images actually tells us that Chinese have been around for many years. We also realize that the Chinese, the majority of the Chinese that we see today in Southeast Asia are the descendants of those who came up in the 19th century and also 20th century. So most of these people came out around that time, and they went through this process from being laborers, being businessmen, to later to settlers, to adopt an identity of Huaqiao, of overseas Chinese instead of Chinese overseas, and later became citizens of their respective countries. So this is something that is a rather common kind of experience that went through by most Chinese communities in Southeast Asia. Even the migration process. The migration process varies. We have those who were Shanghai or those who were sent out as indentured workers, come to work for 3 years and then return to China, etc. But there were also settlers that were brought out by the Christian missionaries. This is something that we have been working on, and we realized that in many settlements in Southeast Asia, Christian missionaries actually brought them out and settled down. And interesting, and you can see that there will be transformation starting from the laborers into settlers. So this has, again, Professor Reed, Anthony Reed, has written a book, or rather edited a book called From Sojourners to Settlers. So again, we have seen topics like this being explored. And from being overseas Chinese, these people began to transform themselves into citizens of their respective countries. This is something very important to us, because if we were to look into the history of these people, they actually went through a lot, and many of them also fought for their countries, fought for the independence of their country. And this is something, again, sometimes conveniently forgotten by others. When the Chinese settled down in their respective countries, the Chinese began to organize themselves. Of course, earlier organizations were mutual help, welfare organizations, so you have a lot of the so-called 会馆 and so on. So you have 会馆 that are based on the county of origins, 大埔会馆, you have all sort of people from different Tong'an and so on. Each of them set up their own organizations in order to take care of their own brethren. But later, some of these organizations began to develop into Chinese Chamber of Commerce, it becoming the Chinese Assembly, and also based on vocations as well. When they have offspring, they began to organize schools for their children. And the Chinese schools has been a trademark of the Chinese existence in Southeast Asia. And we know that the presence of the Chinese school was not welcome. The Guangming Seixiao there is from Ho Chi Minh City or Saigon, and it was no longer there because the government said no more Chinese schools. And this happened in many countries in Southeast Asia where Chinese schools were closed by government policies. But then the idea of schooling, the idea of learning Chinese and so on, sustained. In Indonesia, we have, Prof. Liu have alluded to the fact that, yeah, you don't have full-time school, but you have part-time schools. And this has been a bulwark of sustaining the Chinese presence or the Chinese education. When the Chinese began to learn, began to organize themselves, they also began to publish newspapers. In Malaysia, one of the earliest newspapers will be the Lapor, and this was sustained for many, many years. And if you want to study about history of the Chinese in Malaysia, you have no choice but to read that. Very difficult to read newspapers. So this is something that we always look at. But today, the newspapers have developed into something much bigger. The Chinese actually have broadcasting organization, TV, radio, and so on. But in many countries, these were all closed as well. They were shut down, newspapers were shut down, and so on over the years. The Chinese brought with them their belief system, their religion. So a lot of the temples in here, if you have a chance, if you drive along the highway, you see so many temples, all the glantangs, and so on. And this is evidence of their presence as well. Cultural expression, new way of dressing, all the kubayas of different way, and you look at that, you say that is more of the Chinese kubaya rather than the Indonesian kubaya, for instance. The patterns will be different, and so on. In Malaysia, we have that 24 seasons drum that will be adopted as our national heritage, and so on. So there were processes of acculturation, integration, as well as in some countries, strong assimilation. So this is very much a part of that Chinese experience in Southeast Asia. Of course, China did not forget this group of people, neither had they forgotten their land of ancestral land. Many of these people actually left China when China was having the most difficult times in terms of economic and also peace as well. And many of them decided that I'm going to live abroad, I'm not coming back. But two major events actually kind of really cynicized these people. One would be Sun Yat-sen and his revolution. So he came out here in at least in Malaya, he came and he raised money. He set up Tong Meng Hui, which later developed into Kuomintang. And later, we also have the Gongcantang, the Communist Party, also started their branches in Malaysia, in Singapore as well, I suppose in other parts of Southeast Asia as well. The second event that re-synthesized a lot of Chinese, or brought the Chinese back to China, would be the Sino-Japanese War of 1937 to 1945. And we could see that many Chinese decided to join up as Huaqiao Jigong, as mechanics and drivers, to keep the Lido Road between Burma and China open, so that China will continue to get supported in terms of war materials and so on. And other than that, many of them also returned to join the army to fight in the war. Some went through the Angkor Military Academy to be trained as officers, and others joined as normal soldiers and so on. The little picture there, that's Tan Kah Kee in the middle. He went back, he said, I'm going to give all my support to China, but later, of course, he shifted his support to Yan'an, where he supported Mao Zedong and his fight against Japan. So these two events actually helped to strengthen, rekindle the ties between China and Southeast Asian Chinese, or Chinese overseas at that point of time. And you can see that in many countries there were also what we call consulate, Chinese consulate being set up in order to sustain this kind of ties. But having said all this, the Chinese presence were not really welcome all the time. Most of the period, they were welcome, but they also have to face with the challenge of not being accepted. In Manila, there was a massacre in 1639 that wiped out more than 10,000 Chinese. Same thing in Batavia here in 1740, and later, even in the modern times, when Vietnam and China went to war in 78, 79, the Chinese were asked to leave, and they came back by draft of them. And of course, in this country, they were also experienced very bad experience of 1998, when the Reformasi was taking place. There were many atrocities being conducted against the Chinese. The Pai Hua, the anti-Chinese activities, have been around throughout the entire existence of the Chinese in Southeast Asia. In Malaysia, we have we may not have massacres and things like that, but there were policies, there were sentiments to say that Chinese, you should go back, balik China, balik China, ask us to go back to China, whereas our home country is not China, but Malaysia. So this is the kind of things that we are looking at in Southeast Asia, the challenge of not being accepted. That little book there is a very interesting book. It's published by Lembaga Study Realino in Indonesia, in Jakarta. And this is a very interesting work published in 1996 to tell to the public that the Chinese may be here, Chinese may have a control, penguasa economy, but for them, they have been contributing to the country. So the need to actually come up with this kind of publication tells you something, that there is a need, a constant need to remind others that the Chinese have contributed. You guys have forgotten, so we need to remind you. So this happened even in 1996, and 2 years later, the Reformasi riot and so on took place. Now, in 1978, President, or rather Deng Xiaoping, who was deputy premier at that time, but the big boss of China, started the modernization of China. So within 40 years, we've seen China rise from a very, very poor country to become a superpower in terms of economic achievements. Our largest trading partners, our largest investor in Southeast Asia, And we could see this happening throughout this period. And throughout this period also, we could see China began to change. China began to step up. China began to invest. Chinese began to come up, and so on. So we're going to look into that. And in 2013, President Xi Jinping introduced the Belt and Road Initiatives, and I think that gave the impetus for China to become even stronger and having greater presence in Southeast Asia and the rest of the world. So I'm going to touch on 7 items very quickly. I'm going to say that first, the rise of China actually brought about a strong sense of renewal of having this pride of being a Chinese. This is interesting because before this period of 1978, yes, the Chinese have been around, but then they also experienced a lot of emotional and also quite a lot of challenges, what we call inflicted by the various policies and also by different people. So with the rise of China, there was this pride of being associated with China, but not as citizen, but as part of the larger Chinese cultural circle and the Chinese culture. So the acknowledgement of being Chinese became interesting. For the first time, we have that gentleman there would be President Abdurrahman Gusto. He came out and said, hello, my ancestors, also Chinese. This was unthinkable in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even right up to the point where he was saying this. It's interesting. In my own little experience, I went to school with many Sino natives, or even natives. They have Chinese names, but they say, no, I'm not Chinese. I am indigenous. Right? So the country differentiates different people and so on. That was in the 70s, 80s. Today, many of them will tell me, hello, Danny, this is a picture of my grandfather's grave. Can you read for me, what's my surname? What's my family name? So I will say, oh, you are Chin, or Dan if you are Hokkien and things like that. So we are doing things that were unthinkable. In 1960s, 70s, 80s, they would not acknowledge this. But today, they were proud of this. And this is something that is interesting. We got to investigate this. This is something that, although it is a non-tangible kind of, it's feeling, emotion, but how do we measure this? How do we look into this revival of Chinese pride, reclaiming of Chinese heritage? Here I came and see this general by the name of Teddy Joseph. I think many of you have read his book, Kacang Mencari Kulitnya, the peanuts looking for its shell. Meaning to say he was looking for the roots. And this general, his surname will be Xiong, Hakka Chinese. And they were responsible in building this wonderful building in Taman Mini, Indonesia. It's the Hakka Weilo kind of museum. It's a Chinese museum with Hakka characteristic. So I asked him, what actually prompted you to do all these things? He and a group of people actually do that. He said, the rise of China. The rise of China. It took a bit of time to sink in, but it was the rise of China that actually prompted him. And you can see that the Chinese, that is in the second floor, you can see that the Chinese were telling Indonesia that Indonesia, kepadamu kami berbakti. Indonesia, to you we serve. We dedicated our life to you, in other words. So these are things that are revival of this Chineseness. And the same group of people, Teddy Joseph and his friend, many of them have hosted us when we came to visit them. They started they opened again. They started the newspapers. And this is not only happening in Indonesia. You go to Cambodia, you go to Vietnam even, you go to Laos, Thailand, everyone have started their Chinese newspapers, revive. So the newspapers companies in Singapore and Malaysia have been instrumental in helping them to revive. And today the news media is much more than just newspapers, but they are also going to TV and also to what we call radio and so on. We have seen the revival of Chinese language. Not only Chinese school teaching being revived, but we also seen Chinese language through the Confucius Institutes and also the Confucius classrooms. So my data is a bit different from Prof. Leo's, but basically they are about the same. So you can see the Indonesia having 6 here and Thailand having 16 Confucius Institute. And this is something interesting because we have met now, after so many years, we have met the product of Confucius Institute, went on to do degree programs in China, and now coming back to teach Chinese language in different countries. And I happened to meet someone yesterday from Maranatha University, and she told me her experience of going through that process. So this is something, again, the rise of China with their Confucius Institute have helped to revive a lot of these Chinese languages. Tertiary education in China, having the same thing, going to China to study. Of course, Chinese scholarship helped a lot, but there were also now planned programs by different governments to send students to China to study. Malaysia itself, I put out 800 programs, was recognized immediately by the government of Malaysia. Previously, our students, when they want to learn something, if they study in China, they will go to Taiwan. But Taiwanese degrees were not recognized, despite having provided those degrees since 1952-53. But in China, we recognize almost every program, including the medical schools as well. So this is an avenue that helped a lot of people to achieve their dreams of going to universities, because there are not too many universities in some of these countries. And even in Malaysia, we don't have too many. So China provided another experience. Business opportunity, well, this is something that requires a separate work that we have to actually dwell on. And the rise of China provided a lot of those business opportunities to the Chinese in Southeast Asia. Many, like Robert Kwok, went on to do business there, become rich, and so on. But at the same time, there is the other aspect, the other direction of the traffic, where the Chinese businesses began to come up. First as state-owned enterprises, now as multinationals, and also private companies as well. Tourism is yet another aspect. Well, having said all the nice things, we also have these not so nice things where the ethnic Chinese were seen as an extension of the Chinese from China. So this is something not pleasant, and actually it became a factor, at least in Malaysia, in the political sector, where they brought down the government, actually. Part of it contributed to this. So many Chinese were deemed to be too close to China, and therefore they were perceived to be colluding with them in their country. So this is something that we need to actually help to change this perception. The last point that was raised by, also raised by Prof. Leo just now, would be the Xin Yiming. This is the new migrants. Chinese coming up very big, huge. In Malaysia, we had a rough estimate of at least 120,000 Chinese and their dependents. And at least 50,000 of them have bought properties in Malaysia as second home. I'm sure it is also happening elsewhere. So this is something interesting. Again, Prof. Leo organized a conference that we actually contributed to look at the rising China, but looking at the new Chinese migrants. So the Xing Yiming is now huge in almost every country. So one question that we want to look into is whether or not, or rather how they interacted with the old migrants. So this is interesting, something that we should look at. So you can see Tempo there. I picked this up. That face looks familiar. That's former President Jokowi. And Tempo actually asked this question, welcome, Buruh Cina, Chinese labor. Let me conclude by saying that the Chinese have been around in Southeast Asia for many years. And despite of this, their presence is still being perceived, being asked question on their loyalties as well. But the rise of China actually helped to change a bit of that by giving this identity of being a Chinese, the Chineseness in the different cultural, economics, and so on. And of course, not to forget education opportunities. And we feel that more work needs to be done in order to understand, make sense of the Chinese presence in Southeast Asia, the ethnic Chinese, vis-a-vis the new migrants, as well as the rise of China. But also, at the same time, there is a need to help to change perception that the Chinese in Southeast Asia are loyal to their respective countries. So this is something that we need to dispel that kind of negative perceptions. So with that, I want to thank you for listening to me. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.